Hello and welcome to Infinity. I'm Charlie Seraphin. For the next half hour, we're going to be talking about spirituality and the computer age. Our guest is William W. Whitson. Dr. Whitson is a former career Army officer, former Chief of Foreign Affairs and National Defense at the Library of Congress, former Chairman of Governor Jerry Brown's Earthquake Task Force, and currently Dr. Whitson is Chairman of Centerlink Information Services. Sometimes we think of computers and other advanced forms of technology as the antithesis of spirit. How do they work together?
Well, Charlie, the subject seems to me to need a little definition first, and particularly not so much the subject of computers, which we all think we at least are familiar with, whether we understand them or not, but more precisely the subject of spirituality. And to discuss spirit, it seems to me one has to start with kind of ground rules about the notion of levels of consciousness that we accept in many ways but don't often look at too closely. For example, everyone says, yes, we are spirit, mind, body. So those three levels are taken as a kind of starting point for a discussion of the priority or place of spirit in that hierarchy. It seems to me that within the realm of spirit and the realm of mind, or mind, emotion, or psychology, that there is a dividing line between the two, which science is pushing back deeper and deeper into the spiritual realm. In other words, we know more and more about the realm of psychology and of mind as the years go by, thanks to scientific measuring instruments which weren't available to us 50 years ago. And so we're able to measure signals, levels of energy, ways of communicating that never occurred to us 50 years ago, and which we therefore put in the category of spirit, as if somehow this was so mumbo-jumbo, so immeasurable, that it must be some spiritual phenomenon. And this is not to say that I think you can finally measure God, because God, at the peak of the concept of spirit, is non-measurable. I am that I am is timeless or eternal and spaceless, and science needs time and space to work with in order to repeat experiments, etc. Nevertheless, it seems to me that spirit or spirituality is a broad category encompassing a huge field which in the East has further been broken down into sub-levels. And the computer and the age of communication is really helping us, and obviously pure science helping us to explore those levels.
Is it true that through history we have had periods when spirituality, perhaps represented by church or some kind of an organized philosophy or spiritual philosophy, and government and science are all together in a relatively narrow band, and then we go through periods when they all sort of go off on their own direction? It seems that not too long ago, science and the scientific community were about as far away from spirituality and any spiritual philosophy as we could imagine, and now they seem to be coming back together again. Is that an accurate reflection of what's happening?
I think that's an excellent question, and I think that's very accurate. I think there are periods when the preoccupation with the way things should be done will reflect a general consensus, which you can call a community of mind, about the coming together of whatever we may perceive to be, as a community, what we may perceive to as spirit, mind, body. So that for a brief period then, government, institutions, education, politics, even economics, all of those institutional forms will somehow be fairly accurate expressions and fairly satisfying expressions of the prevailing view of what those three levels may be. We in fact are in a period predicted some years ago by two remarkable men named Maxwell and Wheeler, and written up in a book called The Roadmap of Time by Rod Steiger. And these men said that through 25 centuries, the cycle of integration and disintegration that your question really focuses on so well has repeated itself. That cycle is essentially a 25-year cycle, so that every 25 years we seem to make a transition to some new mode or some new relationship between institutions and the deeper philosophical precepts on which those institutions may be based. And so today, we are really going through a period of profound destruction of large organizations which philosophically had their groundwork, their foundations laid back in the early 20th century. So the whole field of entrepreneurship, the whole field of business, the whole process of divestments and divestitures and mergers, all these things that are going on today reflect a desperate kind of search for really a new emphasis on the individual. Small business today is flourishing all over the country. Granted, there are many bankruptcies, etc., but younger people, and really the generation of the 60s, who are now those people in their 30s and 40s who are coming in to a willingness to explore and who have the resources to explore some of these ideas, are enormously courageous. They don't believe necessarily in joining the large companies and simply fitting into some huge army.
Is the spiritual thread that runs through all of this constant, or does the spiritual thread change and fluctuate as well? Why the 25-year period, and why not a longer period or a shorter period or an irregular situation?
For me, you're asking two questions, one having to do with spirit and its consistency through this process of cycles, and the second question is why the cycle, why 25 years? Let me address the more difficult question as I see it. The spiritual component is a constant. In other words, from my viewpoint, at the deepest level of awareness, all of us share a common spiritual source. In moments when each of us separately, or our collective egos, which you may call nation states or communities, disagree as to who should be getting how much of the economic pie, and those equities, those notions of equity change, obviously, perhaps one could say on a 25-year cycle. When we reach conflict over the notion of equity, we have forgotten our common spiritual source and have decided to identify ourselves with money or with a boundary we call political, which suddenly is who I am. I am an American. Now, 100 years ago, I might have been a Georgian, but suddenly, over a period of 100 years, 4 cycles, I have persuaded myself that yes, my identity, my priority identity is as an American. One of these days, and I think there was a moment back in the 60s when the first man walked on the moon, and a whole planet knew that and saw that. For a brief instant, we all thought of ourselves as earthlings. And then we went back to our games and played the separate notions of, so that in a sense the game that we play that belies our common spirituality is our search for unique identity. And as long as we search for that, we'll keep fighting and conflicting and to some degree miss the fact of the spiritual component.
Some people suggest if we can think of the mind and the body and the spirit, it has been suggested that the computer is modeled after the human mind and functions in similar fashions. Does it incorporate? You can't really separate the mind from the spirit or the body in the human. In the computer, have we done that? Is it a spiritless structure?
Let me try it this way. If we assumed that each of us simultaneously has already within us spirit, mind, body levels, and in fact even more finely tuned levels, but what people sometimes refer to as enlightenment may be only the deep awareness of those levels. So if I choose to identify myself as body, as only a hunk, or as mind, body, It doesn't mean that love, that divine love, that God is not there. I just choose not to hear him. I choose not to be aware of that. Now, it seems to me that the computer is reaching increasingly toward a capacity, especially through artificial intelligence, and through the patterning of communications, through taking enormous amounts of signals and data, which is what the mind does, and create a pattern in order to try to find some meaning out of that pattern. And again, that's what the mind is constantly doing. So in a certain sense, the human being is a communicating entity. It perceives, in fact, there is a whole psychological map based on the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Survey test, a map that was designed over the last 40 years, originated by a doctor named John Gittinger, who now resides in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And it's brilliant because he perceives the human being as a recipient of, is drowning in signals. And the mind then organizes those signals in search of meaning that will be appropriate for action. Only at that moment, that mind, if it expands, will be able increasingly to take out more and more signals and still derive meaning. Well, clearly that's what a computer is trying to do for us. So to a certain degree, the computer can equate with the physical or even the biological process by which signals are converted through neurons, through the central nervous system, into finally perceptions and then social responses. But spirit is another matter, because that is an entirely different set of deep communication. As you approach a kind of consciousness that we will call the deepest or the highest or even God consciousness, we seem to contract time, for example. You seem to know, to be able to communicate with a huge audience. And indeed, some people say you must learn how to screen out all of that communication, because, and that is a form of fear. What will happen to my unique personality if I suddenly realize that I know all of these things, and how could I possibly know them? And most people aren't willing to face that kind of really profound knowledge.
How can the computer then assist in this process? What can we learn about ourselves, our own minds, our own bodies, and our own spirits by interacting with a computer?
Well, let me try just precisely that, the interaction process. There are psychologists now in the Bay Area, and indeed I understand in Boston, who have designed computer interactive programs that in effect query you about who you think you are. And it can be a decision process. So you make decisions based on who you think you are. Case studies may be thrown, little problems are thrown up at you, and you respond. You can question the computer, and finally you respond, and the computer can come back, and if you choose a diagnosis, which increasingly psychology does not like, we don't like diagnostics so much, but if you choose a diagnosis, the computer can say to you, this appears to be the set of values which are driving your search for identity. This seems to be who you think you are right now, because obviously you respond to my questions based on who you think you are. Would you like to go to another level of consciousness? Would you like to try a slightly different way of looking at the problem I just gave you? Now, in one sense, if a therapist does that to you, you get mixed up with the therapist personality. You start hiding things from the therapist. So, curiously, far from being dehumanizing, a computer, in its total indifference to your responses and your questions, some psychologists feel may in fact offer a breakthrough, a way of moving much more rapidly through a kind of self-therapy into levels of consciousness that you weren't really sure you wanted to. As someone has said, if you're in the mystical closet and afraid to come out, don't go out necessarily, just bring the computer in with you.
Is that the potential that science has for assisting us along a spiritual path, that type of thing?
I think that kind of thing. I think that science is now, Western science is reaching to affirm what Eastern thought and Eastern science have intuited for many, many centuries. Western science, in effect, has said, prove it. We want to see it. If it's true, it must be observable, explainable, measurable. Western science is now in physics labs around the country designing measuring instruments which permit us to measure the sensitivity of the human being to some of these signals which, as I say, perhaps a century, even 50 years ago, we would have called intuitive. Telepathy, for example, is something that we may be getting a handle on, precisely because we know that extremely low frequency vibrations are constantly, the Earth is drowning in these ELFs. We begin to suspect that as an individual lowers his brainwave activity to those levels, theta, delta, 7.6 cycles per second, as a transmitter, his mind may be climbing aboard a carrier wave that goes around the planet, and someone 8,000 miles away, who for an instant may have his mind at that level, may pick up this signal and wonder where it came from. Some people have suggested, the Akashic records were recorded at 7.6 cycles per second, and all that knowledge is available if in meditation you'll only go there. I get there by playing golf.
Is it a concern that computers, at least the ones that have been designed to date that I've heard about, don't have heart?
Oh, I think many people are very concerned with that. They see computers and fear them because the computers don't seem to have heart, whatever one may mean by heart. Compassion, even a capacity for, I won't say love, but at least romance. I don't think a computer will ever have the capacity for the kind of love that one associates with God, with spirituality. But it does seem to me that so much of what one calls heart is often a put down. That is, I feel for your problem. I feel for you. Let me sympathize with you. Whereas what the person is really saying is, thank God I don't have this problem, and aren't I slightly superior because I haven't gotten into the mess that you've gotten yourself into. The computer won't do that. I suppose you could program a computer to respond with to signals indicating depression, and so I will now behave as a superior entity and tell you why you shouldn't be depressed while you're around me. But
the new Hal does that.
The new Hal might do that.
The new Hal does that. He talks back and says, "I can see that you're very concerned about this, and I'm sorry that you're feeling this way."
But really, in another sense, you could say if people feel they need heart, one could program responses in a computer. So if you're looking for sympathy, the computer could undoubtedly do that. But you see, I have the vision that what you speak of as heart may really be the search for understanding. Even a silent backboard, knowing that someone is listening to what you're describing as your plight, as your problem, knowing that you're unable to cover all the multiple levels at which that problem might be perceived, but nevertheless wanting some kind of a response. Well, in many ways, a computer could listen to the entire story, dating back not only to your birth, but even to past generations, if you chose to see yourself as the product of all of those generations. And when you had finished, the computer, through artificial intelligence techniques, could say to you, I have heard the form, I've listened to the symbols of your self-identity, of how you identify yourself. Now, in a shortcut, I'll tell you who you seem to think you really are.
Science and computers are most often involved with understanding what is. Yet science and computers have been unable to explain certain phenomena which have been repeated a lot of times. Remote viewing, for instance, other ways of knowing without using the senses. Do you think that we will be able to see the evolution of the computer, read science, to the level that we will be able to, again, for those of us that are born in the Western tradition, explain these things and quantify them and show them in the laboratory?
Yes, I do think that. I think that, as I said at the beginning of our discussion, that what we are defining as spirit because we could not measure the phenomena, will become properly and increasingly deep, if you will, level, thanks to increasingly sensitive abilities first to receive and hear signals, and then the computer capacity to organize them, to manage them and manipulate the signals. I know the work of Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ, who has been on your program before, have been exploring precisely ways of defining just what the signals are that permit remote viewing to occur. I think that their work is eminently scientific. And that has been validated to some extent, at least, by government contracts and government interest in this. We are, through the company that I chair, Centerlink Information Services, now trying to build a database to permit the fragments of knowledge that we have in these many areas to be brought together, whether it's in the biofeedback field, whether the process by which horizontal, if you will, levels of consciousness link with one another vertically. So we know a great deal about the physical level and the physical world, and with Newtonian physics and quantum physics. We know now increasing amounts about patterns of human behavior at the psychological or mental emotional level. We think we know a fair amount about spirit, although sometimes we wonder. But by what process does spirit communicate physical health? In the whole world of healing and health, is a spiritually healthy person necessarily physically healthy? There are those who would argue that vertical relationship doesn't work that way, that you may be very balanced spiritually and even balanced psychologically, and yet because you are going through changes, the whole vertical balance among these levels also begins to change, and you may suffer physically.
How much data do you have to feed into the system to be able to come up with the proper coordinates, to be able to establish patterns? And where will you draw the spiritual data that you can feed in from?
Well, we will continue defining, I think, as spiritual the unknown. That is, it's like years ago we would argue that when a doctor didn't know what was wrong with you, he would say you had a virus. That was kind of a neat package into which they could put all ignorance. In a sense, we know that spirit is there, but as long as we cannot measure spirit, when we can measure spirit, then we will somehow say, oh, that's some other level. That is parapsychological. We will put that in some zone or level that we now can measure, and so for the moment, spirit is still misunderstood, immeasurable, which is where it belongs, and yet we know somehow that as we progress from one level to the next in our own personal development, and even in the development of our collective sense of self, planet, state, whatever one may call it, that there is a process by which we are recognizing increasingly that spirit is an active presence in our lives. And I think that as a computer measures some of these other levels for us and indicates what I believe, hypothetically, we have some proof of this, that at each level there is quite a different set of mathematical relationships, that the signals that we give each other in words at a verbal level, which is psychological, emotional, is only a fraction of the communication that's going on among us and between us. And we're not quite sure how to measure those other symbols, but with computer graphics, with brainwave scanning and CAT scans and so forth and so on, we are beginning to design ways of measuring communications at other levels of consciousness.
You mentioned earlier that your meditative technique is golf. Is that what Centerlink Information Services is all about, right down the middle of the fairway?
Right down the middle. That's the way to put it. Centerlink is really dedicated to putting online, and therefore at the disposal of microcomputer owners, a library of materials basically on spiritual and psychological or emotional patterns. In other words, we know a great deal about case studies of healing and so forth, and personal development insofar as the physical, as far as traditional medicine is concerned. But our editorial committee has now selected out of some 40,000 volumes published over the last 40 years, 6,000 of the best. And theoretically, if you were a subscriber, once Centerlink is fully developed, you would have at your disposal 6,000 volumes through which you could search by theme for those things that might interest you: forgiveness, love, fear, death, and case studies that go with those subjects. The first thing we will put online will be A Course in Miracles, and we hope to have that available for students of A Course in Miracles within about 1 month.
A theme that runs through all mystical traditions is the underlying unity and interconnectedness of all things. Is that what the computers, telecommunications are making the world smaller? They're connecting all kinds of things. Is that what the parallel structure is? Is this a tool in that process, in the mystical process?
Absolutely. In my opinion, I believe personally that all professions, indeed all individuals, are healers. And they become powerful healers when they recognize the way in which to apply their skills to the healing process, healing both themselves and others around them. When people have arrived professionally, and then they take those skills, which before perhaps they were using to make money, to gain recognition, to get status in the profession, and they somehow flip their intention and they decide to use those skills for healing, then in that sense the whole communications industry is an enormous healing industry, because it literally is saying to people all over the world, you're a member of an earth, of a planetary community. I mean, you can choose to define yourself as tiny and little and ineffective if you want to, and say, I'm only from Alameda County, and the rest of it means nothing to me. But most people just don't think that way anymore, and the reason they don't is because of communication. So as computers and communication effectively begin to manage information so that you can manage it, and indeed I think the microcomputer is the breakthrough, that we can take what is happening is that the owner of a microcomputer can go right past the ancient guild system of professionalism, of specialization, and reach out and inform himself in a fraction of the time it took 10 years ago of a vast amount of information. And so you really are in charge. You're in charge of your own life, and yet you have a capacity in an instant to reach out and find a support system of people who think as you do. And that is a kind of communication, a search to validate the level of consciousness and the pattern of perception that you believe you are.
Is it significant that the computer itself doesn't have intention, that the only intention involved in the computer process is that which the operator brings to it?
Excellent. I think yes, I think that's absolutely true, that the computer is only an instrument, and people who fear it are just fearing an instrument. Now, granted, it can be used for, quote, good or, quote, bad, but on balance, it seems to me that it's an instrument for good.
Where are we going with all of this? Give us a quick glimpse into the future through the eyes of Dr. Whitson.
Well, I think that we are moving not only toward personal empowerment, as I said, because of the availability of information and the empowerment that's occurring now all over the country, but we're moving, therefore, toward collective empowerment. And in that sense, I think that we will increasingly move toward patterns of values that will minimize the ancient conflict over right and wrong. Right and wrong and war and peace and those issues, to me, have resulted from disagreements about equity, about who should get how much. As this goes forward, this whole process, I think, will contribute to healing.
This is Infinity. Remember to keep your mind open and listen to your heart. I'm Charlie Seraphin. Thank you for listening.